There's a moment during The Last of Us when you come across a puzzle in which you have to figure out how to cross from one side of a dam to the other. The game's solution to this point A to B problem is as follows. First, crank a wheel that raises only one half of a platform that leads to the other side. Then, jump into the water at the top of the dam, dive under the water, fight some pretty clunky swimming mechanics to find a pallet stuck on a roof of an underwater building. Try to dislodge the pallet by hoping that the detection physics realize you're attempting to interact with it. Resurface. Push the pallet to Ellie and have her hop on. Push her to the other side of the dam. Have her turn the wheel that raises the second platform, which now allows you to cross to the other side. If that sounded fun to you, it's not. The entire sequence feels unnecessary and cumbersome. It's not so much solving a thought-provoking puzzle as it is just fighting through a series of slow movement mechanics. So rather than feel rewarding when you solve it, you just feel relieved and ready to move on. In fact, it doesn't feel like you're solving anything at all, just getting through it. And you know what I did after getting through this section? I kept playing. I kept playing because despite the frustrations I had with this one area, I still had a tremendous interest in seeing what was around the next corner and what else the game had in store for me and its characters. This particular sequence stuck out to me because it combined so many of the game's poor systems, but truthfully, The Last of Us presents this type of situation pretty frequently. That is to say, there's not a whole lot as far as things you are actually doing in the game that feel great. Or at least not on the level you would expect from a game that, on the whole, is a pretty amazing experience. So what the heck is going on here? How can we all unabashedly praise this title when so many of its individual pieces feel less than spectacular? Let's get the hate out of the way first and examine some of these pieces I'm referring to. Some of these specific systems and gameplay features that oftentimes feel pretty average. The Last of Us features a pretty basic combat system that consists of standard gunplay and melee attacks that feel more automatic than interactive. The controls aren't particularly responsive, at least in the way that they don't lend themselves very well to action sequences. The level design is very linear despite some open-feeling environments, and even in those sections, you're not choosing to solve the interaction in different ways. It's more like you're just popping your head over this piece of cover on this side of the room instead of on that side. The puzzle areas in the game consist of every once in a while moving a ladder from one wall to another, or as mentioned, floating a pallet around some water. I actually like the simplicity of the crafting system, but for people who enjoy more complex crafting, this one isn't going to feel particularly innovative or engaging. Now, some of you may be listening to this thinking, are you crazy? How can you have all these negative things to say about this great game? It's probably one of the most refined experiences of the past couple generations. Well, I would challenge you to go back and play through this game again, thinking about some of these issues. Most of the core gameplay in The Last of Us is underwhelming. It just does a fantastic job of making you forget about these weaknesses through its strengths. Because the truth is, despite all of these issues, The Last of Us still somehow consistently delivers an incredibly engaging experience that makes you want to continue to progress through the entirety of the game. The reason for this is that as an experience, The Last of Us is intended to do a couple very specific things, and it does those couple of things very, very well. This game is, in its most essential state, an interactive narrative. It's really more similar to something like Telltale's The Walking Dead series than it is to Naughty Dog's own Uncharted games. By that I mean that everything about the game was built to tell a story. It's not really an action game, it's not really an adventure game, it's just kind of is what happens in this world as the story is going on. The developers did a fantastic job creating a world and moving you through it. Now, I don't think that the world and the environments in The Last of Us are particularly unique as far as post-apocalyptic settings go, but they're certainly nice to look at, and they do their job well, and that is to drive the characters through the story. The game never allows you to stay in one place for too long, and that's not a bad thing. The progression through the game is heavily inspired by the Half-Life 2 formula, and the developers move you through the world in a very similar fashion. It's a linear scripted path that is used as a tool to tell a story. The voice acting is fantastic, and the facial expressions and movements that go along with it are pretty dang good as well. I can't stress enough how important this is. I've played numerous games in which I'm supposed to care about a character, or supposed to care when something happens to them, but I just don't because I've been annoyed by their voice for the past 15 hours. It makes a huge difference to hire talented actors and writers for this work, especially in a game that is so heavily narrative driven, and The Last of Us nails this. Ellie is the star of the show here, and the developers managed to create a very likable and multi-layered character with her that could have easily gone wrong. She's unique in the fact that she's both vulnerable, she's just a kid, but also just enough of a badass. She can certainly hold her own in certain situations, but also needs and wants help and support, not just in dire situations, but also on an emotional level. So Naughty Dog did a great job not letting her fall into the cliches on either side of the spectrum, either making her a completely helpless child that you feel like you're babysitting the entire game, or making her a totally self-sufficient warrior woman that makes you sit back and think, wait a minute, how's a 14-year-old doing all this on her own? She's well-balanced, she's likable, and she's obviously integral to the entire narrative of the game. Joel is not quite as interesting from a personality perspective, but he does go through a much more complex character arc.
Well, dreams are weird.
He's got that gruffness and closed-off nature, which is pretty well explained by his past. I think the developers made a good choice to hit you with what that history is from the beginning of the game, rather than it being something you slowly find out about over time, because the game is really more about the next chapter of his life and how he responds to it, rather than a mystery of figuring out why this guy is the way he is. Again, the writing and voice acting here do a great job depicting Joel as someone who struggles to deal with not only negative emotions, but also positive ones. He is understandably hesitant to become attached to Ellie. But the thing that makes Joel interesting is the change that he goes through throughout the course of the story. While Ellie pretty much remains the same character throughout most of the game, Joel goes through a well-thought-out struggle within himself. He begins the game as simply a guy doing a job with no connection to this girl who he sees as a nuisance, if anything, and he ends it as someone who will do absolutely anything to protect her, to the point where even you as the player begin to struggle with thinking, well, I don't know, has he gone too far? What may be the most impressive achievement of the game is that this entire progression is done gradually and feels natural. It feels like the way a real relationship develops. And this is accomplished through little interactions between the characters rather than these big aha moments, though there are a couple of those thrown in as well. So as far as developing a character and showing how a person can change, as well as demonstrating their motivations for why they change, I'm not sure anyone has done this to the degree of subtlety and believability that Naughty Dog has pulled off with Joel. Really well done.
That's putting it lightly.
Of course, there are other characters as well who come and go throughout your journey. Obviously, none of them are given the same amount of time to really flesh them out as much as the two main characters. So things happen with them that won't necessarily affect you emotionally as much, but they do a pretty good job with the attention they're given in the story. Let me be clear that even if The Last of Us didn't do these few things so well, I don't think it would be a bad game. I just think it would be kind of forgettable. The core gameplay is just not engaging enough to stand on its own. But again, when you take the perspective that the gameplay is just a tool used to drive the narrative forward, it becomes much more effective. I think The Last of Us is a prime example of a game doing something so well that it doesn't necessarily need the rest of its features to stand out. It just needs them to be good enough to not distract from the real experience the developers are attempting to deliver. There's another video I've been working on that examines similar concepts to what I'm talking about here in regards to the game Journey, a popular indie title released originally for the PlayStation 3. Journey is another example of a game that attempts to be an emotional experience. It moves you through the world to tell a story, and it does these things without really having any redeeming gameplay mechanics. So despite the two being two completely different games, they both set out to achieve very similar goals. I think The Last of Us is a great experience, and I think Journey falls a bit flat. The difference between the two, besides like millions of more dollars, man hours, and resources for development of The Last of Us, the main difference is that in The Last of Us, you forgive some of these average feeling systems and situations because it becomes secondary to what you really care about. You care so much about what is going to happen that you forgive what is currently happening. And in that sense, the player becomes a lot like Joel. You will put up with, go through with, and make yourself do whatever it takes to see this thing through.
I need you to...
I know. Step on the pallet.